The police arrived just in time to see Margaret Sinclair in full tennis whites and wielding a measuring tape like a sword, climbing onto the hood of my F-150 and shouting with a shrill voice that this is not your land. It's aesthetic overflow. By the time she was in cuffs, she tried to tow my truck, steal a hedge, and cite me for vehicular vibes. All because I parked in my own driveway. Let me back up and explain how we got to this absolutely insane moment. I'm David Harper, 45 years old, auto mechanic and blissfully boring introvert. 6 months ago, I bought a small home with a double-length driveway in Pine Ridge Estates, a neighborhood where everyone pretends to jog, but actually just gossip in Lululemon. The house was perfect for me. Quiet street, decent garage, and most importantly, a long driveway where I could park my work truck and personal vehicles without bothering anyone. Or so I thought. The president of our HOA was Margaret Sinclair, a woman whose personality could best be described as next-door app. With a superiority complex mixed with a healthy dose of delusion, she stood about 5'4" in her designer sneakers. Always wore coordinating athletic wear, despite never actually exercising, and carried a clipboard everywhere like it was a royal scepter. She'd been HOA president for 8 years and had fined people for things like garage door slowness, emotionally aggressive garden gnomes, and my personal favorite, mailbox sadness. Yes, she actually wrote up poor Mr. Peterson down the street because his mailbox looked depressed after a storm knocked it slightly. Oscu, my crime that started this whole circus was parking my own truck in my own driveway while working on it. During my day off, I'm talking about my personal F-150, legally registered, properly maintained, sitting on my property that I pay mortgage and taxes on. I was changing the oil and rotating the tires on a Saturday afternoon when I first noticed Margaret standing at the edge of my lawn, taking photos with her phone, and writing furiously on her ever-present clipboard. It started innocently enough, with a note taped to my windshield that Monday morning. The note, written in Margaret's distinctive purple ink, read that you are violating community curfew standards. Vehicles may not linger in visible spaces for more than 72 hours without movement. I thought it was a joke at first. The truck had been there for exactly one weekend while I did maintenance. The next day brought an official warning letter on HOA letterhead, complete with a grainy photo of my truck and multiple highlighted sections of the HOA bylaws that she claimed I was violating. The day after that came a $250 fine for driveway clutter and visual disruption of neighborhood harmony. According to the citation, my truck's presence was creating an industrial atmosphere incompatible with our residential aesthetic. I went to the next HOA meeting to dispute it, thinking surely the other board members would see how ridiculous this was. Margaret sat at the head of the table with a presentation she'd prepared, complete with a PowerPoint showing my truck from 17 different angles and a graph supposedly demonstrating property value decline correlated with visible work vehicles. Then came the real madness when she claimed the easement of my driveway technically fell under shared neighborhood influence and that long-term vehicle presence threatened visual cohesion. She actually hired a surveyor to come out and tried to prove that the last 18 in of my driveway somehow belonged to the HOA. The surveyor, a tired-looking man named Bill, told her 3 times that she was wrong before giving up and leaving. But Margaret wasn't deterred. She called a tow truck the following week, telling them it was an abandoned vehicle on HOA property. I was home and intercepted the driver, showing him my registration and explaining the situation. He laughed, told me Margaret calls him twice a month about various cars, and drove away. She then called a landscaper to reclaim what she called neutral property, trying to get them to install a hedge right through the middle of my driveway. The landscaping company owner, who happened to be my neighbor Tom's cousin, called me immediately to warn me about her bizarre request. That's when I called the police for the first time. 2 officers came out, listened to both sides, looked at my property deed, and politely but firmly told Margaret she had no claim to my driveway and needed to stop harassing me. They warned her that any further attempts to interfere with my property could result in criminal charges. She smiled at them like they'd handed her a crown and said in a sickeningly sweet voice that she understood completely and was only trying to maintain standards. The very next morning at 6 a.m., I woke up to strange noises outside. I looked out my bedroom window to find Margaret in my driveway with a can of spray paint, meticulously painting lines on my concrete. She was actually trying to create what she called a designated curb zone to limit where I could park. I grabbed my phone, started recording, and walked outside in my pajamas and slippers. When she saw me, she didn't even try to run or hide what she was doing. Instead, she screamed with righteous indignation that it's not your concrete, it's community adjacent, and I'm establishing proper boundaries for the greater good. I kept filming as she continued ranting about property aesthetics, visual pollution, and something about the spiritual energy of driveways. I had her on camera committing vandalism on my property, which was her first major mistake. Her second mistake came the very next morning when she hired a different towing service without my knowledge and tried to remove my truck while I was in the backyard working on my garden. She must have called around until she found a company that didn't know about her reputation. But the towing crew was professional and called me first when they couldn't find any valid parking violation or HOA authorization beyond Margaret's word. They then called the sheriff's department themselves when Margaret started screaming at them and trying to grab the truck keys from the driver's hand. Sheriff deputies arrived just as Margaret was in the middle of trying to convince the tow driver that I had verbally relinquished driveway sovereignty during a spiritual communion with the neighborhood. She was waving papers she'd printed from the internet about adverse possession and easement rights, none of which applied to the situation at all. The tow truck driver looked relieved when law enforcement showed up. I stepped out holding a printed property plat, city easement confirmation from the county records office, and just for fun, a copy of her voicemail from the previous week, where she says in a haughty tone that the board agrees your truck lowers the neighborhood's frequency and disturbs the chakras of our communal space. The sheriff didn't laugh, but I saw his partner's mouth twitch. They asked Margaret to explain why she was attempting to have a legally parked vehicle removed from private property. Margaret launched into a 20-minute tirade about aesthetic terrorism, the war on property values, and her 16-year experience in community management. She actually pulled out a binder she'd prepared with what she called evidence of my crimes against the neighborhood. It included photos of my truck from every possible angle, testimonials she'd written herself and signed with fake names, and a bizarre diagram showing how my truck was supposedly affecting the fune of the entire street. The deputies were remarkably patient, but when Margaret grabbed the measuring tape from her bag and tried to climb onto my truck's hood to demonstrate what she called optimal vehicle placement theory, they'd had enough. As she scrambled up onto my F-150, still in her pristine white tennis outfit, shouting about aesthetic overflow and vehicular contamination zones, one deputy calmly told her to get down. She refused, claiming she was conducting an official inspection. They arrested her for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted vehicle theft. As they put the handcuffs on, she screamed something about spiritual parking rights and demanded they call her attorney, who it turned out was actually just her nephew who'd passed the bar exam 3 months ago. The entire arrest was witnessed by at least 15 neighbors who'd come out to watch the spectacle, most of them recording on their phones. The HOA board held an emergency vote that same week. Margaret tried to zoom in from the county holding cell, but the connection kept dropping, and all anyone could hear was her shrieking about conspiracies and aesthetic sabotage. The other board members, who'd apparently been waiting for an opportunity like this for years, voted her out by a count of 6-0. Even her usual ally, Barbara, from the Landscape Committee, voted against her after Margaret had accused her of botanical treason for suggesting they reduce the fining schedule. I was reimbursed for every fine she'd levied against me, plus additional compensation for the spray paint damage to my driveway. The HOA attorney resigned that same day, citing recurring nonsense and mental exhaustion. He actually sent a resignation letter that just said, "I can't do this anymore." Margaret has cost this HOA $40,000 in legal fees defending her vendetta. My truck remained in my driveway with a new sign that read "Private Property Parked with Pride," which I made sure was exactly the maximum size allowed by the actual HOA guidelines. The criminal case was even more satisfying. Margaret hired 3 different attorneys before finding one willing to take her case. She tried to argue that she was protecting neighborhood harmony through aggressive aesthetic enforcement and that she had implied authority as HOA president to take whatever actions necessary to maintain standards. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Rodriguez, presented the security footage, the voicemails, the spray paint evidence, and testimony from 12 neighbors about Margaret's escalating harassment. The judge, who looked increasingly bewildered as the case progressed, asked Margaret directly if she understood that being HOA president didn't give her authority over private property. Margaret responded with a 40-minute speech about the sacred duty of community, aesthetics, and the war against visual chaos. She actually brought a slideshow presentation to court showing what she called evidence of aesthetic crimes throughout the neighborhood. The judge had to tell her to stop talking. 3 times when it came time for sentencing, the judge wasn't amused by her defense. He said in a stern voice that HOA authority has limits, and those limits certainly don't include spray painting, private driveways, or attempting to steal vehicles. Margaret was sentenced to 18 months probation, ordered to pay $5,000 in fines, plus $3,000 in restitution for my legal fees and property damage, and banned from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. Her face turned purple when the judge read the sentence, and she shouted that this was a conspiracy against visual excellence before her lawyer frantically whispered for her to stop.